Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the college football main slate for Saturday, November 18th, week 12 now of the college football season. We're going to be breaking down the main slate on DraftKings and FanDuel, the one that starts at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. We've got a nice little slate this weekend, and really it's kind of a sad time of the year because even though we've got all these sports going on and it's really cool and there's always something good to watch, college football is kind of winding down. So this is really the last full big time Saturday that we're going to get because next week it's going to be a little segmented because there's going to be games on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So definitely looking forward to this one. This is one of the last big college football main slates of the year. So we deep dove and did all the research. We're going to give you guys all the info. We're going to talk about the games that we want to target for this slate. We're going to talk about the best plays at quarterback, running back, and wide receiver for this big Saturday main slate. Now, if you have come all season for just college football, I hope that you will stick around for another sport because right now we are a four-sport podcast for the time being. We are doing golf, which our episode for the RSM Classic is uploaded on the audio feed. Didn't have time to break out the computer and upload that one to YouTube, but that one is on the audio feed. And then we also are doing NFL on a weekly basis, and we're also doing college basketball pretty regularly as well. So if you play DFS college football, try DFS college basketball. Like college football, there's not an edge. There's not a whole lot of sharp money playing it. And just by doing research and by kind of knowing how to build out lineups, you can really win yourself some money on college basketball DFS. We've had a great start to this season so far. So I'm hoping that if you've been here for college football, you'll subscribe so you get those notifications and you'll stick around for other sports as well as we transition to a different time of year. Anyway, that does it for the introduction. Let's go ahead and start breaking down the slate by looking at the games that we're going to want to target this Saturday. All right, so we're looking at the lines for Saturday, courtesy of FanDuel Sportsbook. And I got to say, I think DraftKings did a pretty solid job of game selection for this Saturday slate. There's a lot of games being played this Saturday, and there's quite a lot of them that would just not be that appealing to play from a DraftKings and FanDuel perspective. So I do think DraftKings did a pretty good job of weeding out the bad games and picking the best ones. There's a few games that could have been on there that would have been a little bit fun, but other than that, I think they did a pretty good job of kind of narrowing the pool down this weekend and avoiding some games that would not be such great environments. So, as we always do at the Games Target, we're going to talk about some blowouts. We're going to talk about some shootouts. So, blowouts are double-digit point spreads where one team is implied over 30 points. So the first one is going to be Michigan at Maryland. Michigan is 19.5-point favorites. This game is implied to be 35-16 in favor of Michigan. So you got another game where Michigan's going to be implied to score 5 touchdowns. And Maryland, I actually think Maryland's not a bad football team, but trying to play anybody against this Michigan defense is usually just going to be a no-go. And so this week, I do think in that game, you're going to want to prioritize targeting Michigan guys over the Maryland guys. Now, the next one is going to be Oklahoma taking on BYU. It has been a rough year for BYU in the first year of the Big 12, and they just haven't really been able to compete on a week-in, week-out basis with a lot of these top-tier teams in this league. And looking at this game, it's going to be more of the same story. It's projected to be Oklahoma 40-16, and that is the highest team total on the slate for Oklahoma. They are projected to be the highest scoring team on this Saturday main slate. And then the next one is going to be Georgia taking on Tennessee. A little late in the season for this game. I feel like this rivalry game normally gets played a little bit earlier, but this one has Georgia's 10.5-point favorites, 58.5-point total. So it's projected to be about 34-24 in favor of Georgia. It would not be the craziest thing in the world for this game to end up shooting out. However, this Tennessee offense with Hendon Hooker last year only ended up with 1 touchdown, and I don't think they're as good this year with Joe Milton as they were last year with Hendon Hooker. Next up is going to be Notre Dame taking on Wake Forest. Revenge game for Sam Hartman, if you will, the Wake Forest transfer, now quarterbacking for the Irish. And this one is projected to be 35-11 in favor of Notre Dame. So with Wake Forest having an 11-point total, you can just go ahead and cross out all Wake Forest players off your player pool. Even if I just don't see this game being a game where Wake Forest is able to score a lot of points and keep up with Notre Dame. Now, the last blowout of the day is one of the last games of the slate. It's going to be Oregon taking on Arizona State. Oregon is 23.5-point favorites, so it's projected to be 38-15 in favor of Oregon. Oregon is the second highest team total on the slate behind only Oklahoma. Now, for some shootouts, there are 4 of them here on this slate. Remember, when I define a shootout, I'm looking for a 1-possession point spread, and I'm looking for a point total over 50. So the first one is going to be the game that College Game Day is at. and that is Appalachian State taking on James Madison. A little battle between two of the top teams in the Sun Belt. That one is currently projected to be James Madison 32-24. So both teams are targetable in that game, with both of them having a projected over 24-point total. And then you've got UNC Clemson is the next shootout. That one is going to be ironically, Clemson's 6.5-point favorites, and is projected to be 32-26. I thought that was a little bit of an interesting line when I first saw it, because I actually think this North Carolina team's pretty good, and I would like to see North Carolina make the ACC championship over Florida State. But it seems like the books have really factored in Clemson's recent performance against Notre Dame in thinking that they're going to be able to beat this North Carolina team here on this Saturday. Either way, for DFS, both these teams are implied at least 26 points, and I tend to think that if North Carolina were to win this game, it would be because of them scoring a lot of points. I think that if Clemson wins, it could end up being more of kind of a knockdown, drag out, ground and pound type of game. But North Carolina is going to win. It's going to be by way of their offense. Next up is going to be Oklahoma State taking on Houston. And that one is kind of an interesting selection for this slate. But, Oklahoma State's still got Ollie Gordon. And so that's kind of one of the appealing reasons why this game might have made it to the slate. This one is projected to be 33-27 in favor of Oklahoma State. But the game that has the two teams with the most implied total, the highest total on the slate, belongs to UCLA at USC. The battle for Los Angeles total is 65.5. USC is currently 6.5-point favorites. That line has actually jumped from the last time I did my research, because I had down a different number. So looking at it now, this game is implied to be 36-29 in favor of USC. And so both teams implied 29 points in that one. That is probably the game that is the most likely to shoot out on the entire slate, simply because USC doesn't play a lick of defense. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the DraftKings board and figure out how we're going to fill our lineups with players from those games. So at this very start here, quarterback position, we've got two starting quarterbacks above 10K. We've got defending, reigning Heisman Trophy winner, I should say, Caleb Williams, and then we've got Heisman hopeful Bo Nix. Both of these guys are absolutely in play for me. I don't think you can get to both of them very comfortably on this slate, but I do think both these guys are in play. The question is, which one would you rather play, right? Well, if we look at the raw numbers, Caleb Williams has been a better fantasy point per game player than Bo Nix this season by about 1 point. If we look at this slate, Bo Nix's Oregon Ducks are implied about 3 more points than Caleb Williams' USC Trojans. Now, the next part of this, though, is interesting. I find it easier this week in starting out and doing early builds to fit Caleb Williams into lineups. And why is that? Well, Caleb Williams is a quarterback that when he scores a lot of fantasy points, he does a lot of it via his legs, by scoring touchdowns with his legs, and he spreads the ball around a lot. He doesn't feature one or two primary wide receivers. So you can play Caleb Williams unstacked and be successful. Whereas Bo Nix, you're going to want to play him stacked with either Troy Franklin or Tez Johnson, who are expensive in their own right at the wide receiver position. So I do think that it's easier to squeeze Caleb Williams into lineups if you play him unstacked, but I do think that Bo Nix is playable as a stacking partner with Tez Johnson and Troy Franklin. But at the end of the day, I'm going to be playing some of both of these guys, and I don't know which one it's going to be more of yet. But like I said, I do think it's a little bit easier to fit Caleb Williams into lineups. Now, when it comes to these guys reaching their ceiling, they've both displayed a similar ceiling so far this year of about 40 fantasy points. And the way that these guys would not get to their ceiling is by the running backs on their team vulturing the touchdowns, right? If the running backs have a lot of rushing touchdowns, that's going to box out these quarterbacks from scoring a lot of fantasy points, right? Well, on the season, Oregon running backs have accounted for 21 rushing touchdowns. USC running backs have accounted for 17 rushing touchdowns. So with everything else being similar, it's probably slightly more likely that Caleb Williams accounts for all of the USC touchdowns than Bo Nix accounting for all of the Oregon touchdowns. Now, let's go ahead and look down the board from there, because sitting down in the 9K range is Dylan Gabriel, coming off of a ceiling week. He proved to everybody that he does have a legitimate fantasy point ceiling last week with a 62.92 fantasy point total, accounted for 8 total touchdowns. However, this week, I would prefer not to chase that performance. If you look at it and say, well, Dylan Gabriel's playing great, he's got a great match against BYU, I'm going to play him, go for it, knock yourself out. I am not going to chase the ceiling performance, though, because I don't think it's likely that it happens again. When you look at how he got there, Yes, the yardage totals were pretty good, 423 passing, 50 yards rushing, but he accounted for 8 touchdowns. 38 of those 62.92 fantasy points came from touchdowns, meaning the only 24, or the other 24, excuse me, came from the yardages, right? And before that game, he didn't have games where he even sniffed 8 touchdowns. He had one game of 5 touchdowns, and he had 2 games of 4 touchdowns out of 9 games total. So I just don't think it's very likely that he has another game where he accounts for 5 or more touchdowns, and he's priced up like he is going to account for 5 or more touchdowns. So Dylan Gabriel for me this week is largely going to be a pass. I might sprinkle him in as a pivot off of Caleb Williams and Bo Nix for a lineup or two, but he's largely going to be a pass for me this week. Drake May has been one of the safest options in college football DFS since Tez Walker was deemed eligible by the NCAA. You can almost find a direct split when Tez Walker became eligible. It was the Syracuse game. Drake May has not been under 25 fantasy points since Tez Walker started playing for this UNC Tar Heels team. He probably has the highest, safest floor of anybody in college football DFS right now. However, the matchup is not as great against Clemson as Bo Nix and Caleb Williams have against their Pac-12 opponents. So I do think that Drake May is going to be in a little bit of an ownership squeeze where people are either going to opt to pay up for Williams, Nix, or Gabriel, or try to pay down at quarterback to some of the guys in the 8K range. Now, I did say 8K range because I think there's going to be a lot of people that just cross off the next little group of quarterbacks. JJ McCarthy, to me, is a terrible misprice in a bad way. He should not be $9,100. He attempted 8 passes last week. You just simply can't pay off a price tag of $9,100 when you're going to attempt 8 passes. It's not happening. Unless you're like a triple option quarterback, in which case you're going to run for 500 yards and 2 touchdowns. But it's just not happening. I just don't get why he's priced up this far. I think he would be a solid play if he were like 7,500, but not at 9,100. I can't do it. So I think nobody's going to play McCarthy this week. I will not be one of them. Carson Beck of Georgia is not a bad option, but he's getting priced up to a point where I don't think he's very playable as well. Only 2 of the 10 games he's played so far this year has he hit 3 times value for his salary. That would be 27 fantasy points, and 3 times value is kind of like the baseline of what you want in like a cash game or maybe a min cash in a GPP at the quarterback position. So I just don't like the price point for him either. And I think Tennessee is more of a team that you can get on the ground than through the air. They've given up more 100-yard rushers this season than 300-yard passers. And then Jack Plummer, I also think is mispriced. He is mispriced like he can play at his ceiling, which was a week 4 performance against Boston College, where he had 44.72 fantasy points. Since that game, he's played 6 games, and he's scored 65.6 fantasy points. So in the 6 games since his ceiling performance, he has averaged 11 fantasy points per game. Can't get behind it. I think he's a terrible misprice, and I'm not going to be playing him at that price. So the bottom line is McCarthy, Beck, and Plummer, because of where they're priced at, nobody's going to play them. So I mentioned this on the podcast a few times in the past year or so. Sometimes a bad play becomes a good play in DFS when nobody plays them. And so I don't think anybody's going to play McCarthy, Beck, or Plummer. So if you're willing to take that shot, take that chance, and play a guy who's obviously mispriced in a bad way, it might end up helping you in a GPP if they have a ceiling week. But the bottom line is I don't think it's very likely that they have a ceiling week, and they're going to need a ceiling week to pay off that price tag. Now, the guy that I do think a lot of people are going to play is Jordan McLeod of James Madison. He has been really good lately. He's hit 3 times value in 5 of his last 6 games, and the one he didn't was only 24.36 fantasy points, which wouldn't kill you in a GPP or a cash game. And he's had a 55-point ceiling. He had 55 fantasy points against Georgia State when he was on the DraftKings main slate 2 weeks ago. And this team, JMU today or this week, they have an implied 32-point total. So if JMU is going to score 32 points, Jordan McLeod is probably going to get you at least 25 fantasy points. I think he's a really solid option. I think he's an elite cash game option that is much cheaper than the other quarterbacks at the top. And I mean, just if you look at the numbers, he averages 29 fantasy points per game even. Bo Nix averages 29.8. So Jordan McLeod, you're getting pretty much the same player from a fantasy point perspective for a season-long total. It $2,000 cheaper than Bo Nix is. So I think Jordan McLeod is an elite option. He's going to be very popular this week. Donovan Smith of Houston has been very hit or miss this season. He scored 25 or more fantasy points 5 times. And when you look at the anatomy of how he gets there, I think he is a quarterback that I want to play in a game stack where I'm playing a lot of different options from both sides of Houston and Oklahoma State. The reason why, every time Donovan Smith has scored 25 or more fantasy points, All 5 of those games have seen 49 or more total points scored, and Houston's opponent in all 5 of those games has scored at least 24 points. So if Donovan Smith is going to hit his ceiling, the other team across from him is probably going to hit their ceiling as well. And oh, by the way, this could very likely turn into one of those games because the implied total is 33 to 27. So I definitely think Donovan Smith is in play. And if I play him, I'm going to be loading up with other Oklahoma State Cowboys and Houston Cougars. Sam Hartman's an intriguing play because he does get the revenge game. And he just hasn't been great since like the very start of the season. The first month of the season, he was fantastic. And then he just played Ohio State and has never been the same. He hasn't scored 17 fantasy points since week 3. But what that means is nobody's going to play him. He's got the revenge game narrative, and his team's implied 35 points. So I think Notre Dame would love to go out there and let Sam Hartman have a big day against his former team. And at only $7,500, that's not an expensive price tag to have to pay if you want to give that a shot. Joey Aguilar is the App State quarterback on the other side of James Madison. He's been a very consistent option. He's had 6 games of at least 22 fantasy points in a row. That's nothing to sneeze at, and at only $7,500, that's not a very like unreasonable price tag. I think you can play both McLeod and Aguilar and kind of game stack it and hope that this game ends up shooting out. Noah Fafita was the guy that everybody played last week against Colorado on the DraftKings main slate, and he kind of let everybody down just a little bit. Only 16 fantasy points. We were looking for more than that. So I think nobody's going to play him this week, and he's taking on Utah, which is a really tough defense. So I think he's going to be like super lowly owned. I probably won't get to him, but I always wonder about the psychology of DFS. After somebody lets you down, how many people go back to him the next week? So I don't think Noah Fafita is going to be played by very many people at all this slate. Now, the last guy that I'm intrigued by is Ethan Garbers of UCLA. He's listed as probable. He did miss their last game, and UCLA's offense did not look good in their last game, so it's not like he's going to get benched. He started 2 games and finished 2 games. He started 3 games. He's finished 2 of them so far this season. In the 2 games that he finished, he accounted for 22.7 and 21.5 fantasy points. So I don't think it's unreasonable to play him in DFS and hope that he gets the 22 or 21 again that he had in those 2 starts. And oh, by the way, he's taken on USC, who is one of the worst defenses in all the Power 5. So I think Ethan Garbers is absolutely in play, and I wouldn't go to a quarterback that is cheaper than him on this slate. All right, that does it for the quarterback position. So let's take a quick breather and then let's talk about the running backs. Now, before I start with the running back position, I do want to talk about there is places where you can get more information from me if you so choose to. First off, you can follow me on X at Mike's Money Picks. I tweet out the DFS rundown for every college football slate where I just kind of go through some categories and highlight my favorite plays in those categories. I also tweet out if there's any injury news that affects my opinions or gives you some alternatives for your lineups. I usually am able to tweet out about it. And then I'm also in the Fantasy Corner Discord. It is 100% free, and it is one of the best places you can come. We have all levels of DFS players in there. We do all sports, college football, college basketball, NFL. NBA has been one where some of the guys in there have helped me become a lot better at. And we've had a lot of success with a lot of people in the Discord with college basketball the first 2 weeks of the college basketball season. So if you want to, talk it out, get some ideas from some guys of all levels, the Fantasy Corner Discord is a great place to come. Link is in the description. And we've had a lot of guys have a lot of success in there the last few weeks. And then also, I do write full slate articles on my Patreon for every college football slate. I do it for college football, college basketball, NFL, and golf. And so you get my full core plays, why they are my core plays, and kind of my attack plan for how I'm building out lineups and how I'm attacking the slate. I'm not guaranteed that you're going to, read them and instantly win GPPs, but I guarantee you can take them, use the information, and help become better at DFS and help become better at building out lineups, particularly in college football and college basketball, where not a lot of people have a lot of experience doing it. So patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks if you are interested in that. And then also, I am partnered with Sign Up Expert, and what they do is they give you the best offers and promo codes for new users on any DFS player prop or sportsbook site. So head on over to signupexpert.com/Mike's Picks. Link is in the description. It will even sync to your area to show what's available in your state or province. So in North Carolina, where I'm from, sports betting is going to become legal on January 1st. So I know on January 1st, when those books open up, that's where I'm heading to get the best offers and promo codes for new users for all those sports books that are going to be available in my state. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the running back position now. So the running back position and how it's constructed this week is why I think it's going to be supremely difficult to pay up for 2 quarterbacks this week, particularly 2 of the quarterbacks in the 10K range or 9K range. There's not a whole lot of obvious value running backs. Now, might we end up in a situation where there's a running back that, deals with a nagging injury or is a surprise scratch, and that opens up some value? Yes, that always happens in college football, right? But right now, there's not a whole lot of value at running backs. However, there is a lot of great running backs that are great plays at the top of this slate. Starting off with Ollie Gordon, who is now priced up appropriately right after he conveniently let everybody down last week. He was about 80% ownership last week in that game against UCF. It was a dream matchup where he was at a dream price tag and he got 6.2 fantasy points. But hey, because so many people played him, there were still a lot of lineups that cashed in GPPs that had Ollie Gordon simply because everybody played him. And so I don't know if everybody's going to go back to him or not, but I'm willing to go back to him. This Houston rush defense is nothing special. They give up about 4.3 yards per carry, which is a higher number than the NCAA average. So I'm willing to go back to Ollie Gordon. I don't know if everybody is or not, but hey, I'll gladly be the one that's playing him this week if nobody wants to go back to him after he burned him last week. Next up is Blake Corum of Michigan, who finally had a big time performance with 29.5 fantasy points against Penn State. And I kind of think that you have a solid thesis now that Blake Corum needs Michigan to be pushed at least a little bit to reach his ceiling, right? That was his high in rushing attempts on the season. It was his high in fantasy points on the season. And it was his high in yardage on the season against Penn State. And Penn State's a good defense. So if you think Maryland keeps this game at least a little bit close like Penn State did, then that is probably going to be the best opportunity to play Blake Corum. And I think that this is a pretty solid spot to put him because I do think Maryland is a better matchup for Blake Corum than Penn State was. But I do think that he needs Maryland to keep that game slightly close so that way Michigan just doesn't, completely take their foot off the gas. Audric Estime, I really like as a play this week as well. He had 22 fantasy points 2 weeks ago against Clemson, and that's a pretty solid rushing defense. He almost got to 100 yards, made 3 straight games for him of over 22 fantasy points, and we would be willing to live with that in a GPP if he just gives us another 22 fantasy point performance. But Wake is a really solid matchup for the running back position. Notre Dame's projected to win this game by more than 20 points, so they will be grinding out the clock and, grounding and pounding the ball in the second half. And Wake Forest gives up 4.2 yards per carry, which is right on line with the NCAA average. So I definitely think this is a really good spot for Audric Estime. And I think Notre Dame is going to have a big time advantage, on the offensive and defensive lines in this game against Wake Forest. And so that should really help out the run game. Audric Estime, really solid play at $8,000. And I think a lot of people are either going to play Gordon or Corum and ignore Estime. And he does not need to be ignored. Bucky Irving is next up at $7,600. I think he is a great pivot from playing Bo Nix. Like, if you want to get exposure to the Oregon offense, but you're fading Bo Nix, play Bucky Irving, because if Bo Nix doesn't reach his ceiling, it's going to be because Bucky Irving reached his. And so I think there's a legitimate argument to be made for like a Caleb Williams, Bucky Irving build and just hoping that Bo Nix just doesn't get there, right? And so it's $7,600. Bucky Irving's going to need about 22-ish fantasy points to pay off that price tag, but I think he can absolutely do so. He's had 6 straight games of 20 or more fantasy points. And he's at his best in close games. So if Arizona State is able to keep this a little bit close, that might be how he can reach his ceiling, but it is not currently projected to be close. There's at least a 20-point spread in that one. Now, below Bucky Irving, I do think you can nitpick each and every one of these guys in the 7K range and even heading down to the 6K range. So below Bucky Irving, you've got Dejon Edwards of Georgia, who is splitting carries with Kendall Milton. His production has still been good, but Milton just kind of eats up more and more of a chunk of the carries each week. Amarian Hampton has been a really productive back this season. That 27 fantasy points per game season-long total is impressive, but he's facing the toughest rush defense he's seen all year in Clemson, and I think there's an argument to be made that you could fade him for that reason. Jawar Jordan is banged up, and he's also facing another tough rush defense in Miami. Miami, for all their woes this season, they've been pretty solid on the offensive and defensive line. And so I don't think this is necessarily the best spot to play Jawar Jordan. And with him being banged up, he's ceding carries to Isaac Guerendo. But the problem is that they priced up Guerendo up here at $6,500 as well, which makes him kind of unplayable also. And I have no interest in those two guys if they're going to be splitting carries against this rush defense of Miami. Now, Nate Noel of App State is going up against James Madison, who is statistically the best rushing defense in the country. They only give up like 3 yards a carry to the running back position. They've not allowed a running back to rush for more than they've allowed one running back to rush for more than 50 yards all season. It was Marcus Carroll of Georgia State. And so Nate Noel, really tough spot with that matchup. Probably not going to make my player pool for that reason. Now, a guy that I can get behind, though, is Carson Steele, former Ball State transfer. He has had an up and down year at UCLA, but we know this Chip Kelly offense loves to run the football, and we know that USC doesn't play a lick of defense. And so I'm willing to go back to Carson Steele and hope that this UCLA ground game gets going against the Trojans. If I'm not playing Ethan Garbers, I'm probably going to be playing Carson Steele because UCLA is going to score points, right? USC, their defense is going to give up some points. They're just not good. And so the question is, who's it going to become that ends up scoring it? I think Carson Steele is a good nominee for that. And he's going to be a guy that I'm going to be playing a lot of for that reason. Now, TJ Harden, his backup, is still stealing a little bit of carries. So I do think that TJ Harden is in play in GPPs because I do think that Steele will be pretty popular. So if you fade Carson Steele, play TJ Harden, you might get a little bit of leverage there. Now, below $6,000 on DraftKings, the running back room looks a little bleak. Like there's not a whole lot of options here. Will Shipley is back to a full workload after suffering a concussion, and I think $5,900 for him is very reasonable. UNC is not a particularly great or particularly bad run defense, but if the workload is there for Shipley, he's a solid option. Cam Scatabo is another workload dependent play where this team gives him the ball quite a lot because they don't trust their quarterback at all. And if they want to compete with Oregon, Oregon's a pretty stout defense, but if they want to compete with them, it might be getting the ball in the hands of Scatabo. And so I do think he is in play for that reason as well. Gavin Sawchuk has kind of taken over as Oklahoma's RB1. He had 22 attempts last week against West Virginia. Tawee Walker only saw one carry in that game. And Marcus Major did not see a carry in that game. So I don't really know what's going on with this Oklahoma backfield. But if Sawchuk is going to be the leader of the committee, then he's going to be in play. He's hit 100 yards in back-to-back games. He's hit at least 16 fantasy points in back-to-back games. And at a cost tag of $5,500, he's absolutely in play. But pay attention throughout the week to the different injury news and developments when it comes to the Oklahoma running backs. Like I guarantee you that outlook is going to change on a day-by-day basis. Like right now, Marcus Major has the Q tag next to him, and Tawee Walker, like I said, only one carry against BYU or against West Virginia. So I don't really know what to make of the backfield. But hey, if the backfield's going to belong to Gavin Sawchuk has got to make your player pool. Next up, last running back that I'm interested in is Jaquindon Jackson of Utah. He seems to be back to his old ways a little bit after returning from injury. Washington's a pretty tough defense, but he was able to get 17.7 fantasy points against him thanks to the 2 touchdowns. And I don't think this team trusts their quarterback entirely, so I think they're going to be running the football. And Arizona is a pretty solid matchup. And Jaquindon Jackson, we know he is a big play guy. He was a big play guy last year. He was a big play guy at the start of the season before he got hurt. And so I think he's a pretty solid option at only $5,400 here this Saturday. All right, that does it for the running back position. So let's go ahead and take a quick breather, and then let's talk about the wide receivers. Now, before we go ahead and talk about the wide receiver position, I do want to mention if you're watching this on YouTube, please go ahead and hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out a lot if you like the video, and it just helps the video get noticed, helps it show up in searches, and I really do appreciate it. And if you like what you're seeing here, hit that like button. It helps me out a lot, shows me a lot of support, and subscribe to the audio feed and the YouTube channel as well, so that way you'll be notified when new episodes drop, because we are going to have some episodes that are audio only for various sports, just if I don't have time to get out the full setup and do the full recording. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the wide receiver position. So I always like to talk about wide receivers in terms of stacking options with the quarterbacks because more often than not, that's how I'm playing them. I'm playing them stacked with the quarterback more often than not. So for Oregon, they've got Troy Franklin and Tez Johnson. Let's talk about both of them. So Troy Franklin has an incredible floor. He's had double-digit fantasy points in every single game this season, and he's actually had a catch of 30 or more yards in every single game this season. That's kind of an incredible stat. It means that he's breaking off a big play pretty much every single week. Now, he is an expensive stacking option with Bo Nix, and incredibly expensive stacking option with Bo Nix. It will make the rest of your lineup kind of hard. I think you'd have to get really cheap on your second quarterback and second wide receivers, but I do think it is possible. Tez Johnson is a slightly cheaper stacking partner, and he has been very much better than Troy Franklin in the last 2 games. In the last 2 games, Tez Johnson has accounted for 80 fantasy points. That's about 40 fantasy points a game. That's an insane pace. If he were to keep doing that, then obviously you'd have to play him, but I don't know if he's going to continue to keep doing that. But what is notable is that in those two games, he has outcaught Troy Franklin 19-8. So maybe the tides are starting to turn, and Tez Johnson's starting to be the stacking partner that you want with Troy or with Bo Nix. But I do think both these guys are in play, and I do think it would be pretty much impossible to play Bo Nix and both of these guys in the same lineup unless you really want to try to get cheap at running back and wide receiver and your second quarterback. The only other guy from this Oregon offense that I would be interested in is the tight end Terrence Ferguson. I mean, you would just be hoping that he falls into the end zone, and that would end up giving you a solid outcome for a guy who's only $4,200. But I'm pretty much not interested in any of the other wide receivers because right now this Oregon offense is very concentrated around Franklin and Johnson. Now, on the Arizona State side of things, Elijah Badger is the guy that I am very much interested in. Last week, he had 15 total targets and he caught 12 of them for 116 yards, and his team only had 149 passing yards. So you're looking at a guy who had about 80% of his team's passing yardage total, which is just insane. And if Arizona State is going to keep this game close, if they're going to push this game, it's probably going to be because of Cam Scatabo and Elijah Badger. Their offense is really concentrated around those two guys. And so I would really be willing to play Elijah Badger, particularly in a game stack with the Oregon guys, because if Oregon's going to get pushed, it's going to be because of him. Now for UNC, Tez Walker's return has been a big plus for this offense. He has been the clear wide receiver one since he returned. And when you look at the stats, they've been pretty darn impressive for his return. In 3 of 5 games, he's hit 3 times value. The Georgia Tech game, I'll give him a little bit of a pass because he left that game early. And then the Campbell game, they were up so big, it didn't really matter. He didn't have a full game to reach 3 times value. So in the 3 full games that Tez Walker's played, he hasn't scored under 26 fantasy points. Now, Bryson Nesbitt is kind of turning into the second option from the tight end position in this offense. He's had double-digit fantasy points in 4 straight, at least 13 fantasy points in 4 straight. He's caught a touchdown in 3 of those 4 games. I think he's absolutely in play at $5,000. I would have preferred to see him a little bit cheaper, but he is a guy that you can kind of pivot to if you don't want to play Tez Walker, or you can double stack Drake May with both those guys. But the rest of the receiving core for North Carolina, McCollum, Jones, Blackwell, Copenhagen, Morales, they've just been so inconsistent that I don't really feel the need to go to them. And so if I'm playing the Carolina passing it, I'll be prioritizing Walker and Nesbitt. Now, on the Clemson side of things, Antonio Williams is still out, and that's kind of been it's made their receiver room easier to target in DFS because what has happened is that all their production is kind of lumped to 3 guys, and it's been Bo Collins, Tyler Brown, and Jake Briningstool. Bo Collins has been kind of operating as the wide receiver one, even if he's not always having a wide receiver one game. He doesn't break off a whole lot of explosive plays, but he is kind of just a steady option. Had 5 targets last week against Georgia Tech. Tyler Brown led the team in targets against Georgia Tech. He had 8 of them. I think he's a little more likely to kind of break off a big play or have a big time performance than Bo Collins. I think he has a little higher ceiling, and he's only $200 cheaper than Bo Collins. And then you have the tight end Briningstool, who had 6 targets last week, so right sandwiched in the middle between Collins and Brown. And he's a guy who, if he finds his way into the end zone, he's going to give you a very solid value. At only $4,000, he is absolutely in play this week for me. So this UNC Clemson game, a lot of very reasonably priced options at the wide receiver position. Now, in terms of one-off plays, just looking at the top of the board, Brock Bowers and Jamari Thrash are guys I would be willing to play as one-off plays, meaning I think you can play them unstacked with their quarterback. Like, there's just a very good chance that Brock Bowers has a ceiling game, and Carson Beck doesn't. So for that reason, I'm willing to play Bowers without playing Beck. However, I will say, and the same goes for Jamari Thrash taking on Louisville. But I will say that I would prefer to pay up at the running back position than to pay up for a one-off wide receiver this week. I think that the options at the running back position are so bleak. I would rather make sure I've got my guys there and try to find value at the wide receiver position than the other way around. Now, the USC wide receivers continue to be a headache. All season long, I've been a proponent of playing Caleb Williams unstacked. because the USC wide receivers are super inconsistent. You never know who he's going to target, and he spreads the ball around quite a bit. And then also, for whatever reason, DraftKings prices them up unreasonably expensive and makes it very hard to get to them. And that's the case again this week. You've got Taj Washington at 7K even, Brendan Rice at 6,500, and then a whole lot of guys that barely even play at above 5,000. And it's just like, what are you doing, DraftKings? I'd play these guys if they were at 4,000, but I can't get to them now that they're at 5,800. But the good news is that it's starting to kind of lump around Taj Washington and Brendan Rice. They're starting to be the clear target leaders and the clear fantasy scorers now. So if you are going to stack Caleb Williams, I would recommend Rice or Washington. But even then, I think it's totally viable to play Caleb Williams unstacked because even those guys are not super consistent, not super high ceiling options. So Caleb Williams unstacked might be the move if you are playing Caleb Williams this week. Now, UCLA, like we mentioned earlier, is going to score points. But the question is, at the wide receiver position, who is it going to be? Well, Logan Loya is kind of the obvious name. He's been their wide receiver one all season long. He has had one fantasy performance over 20 points, so not a massive ceiling. But hey, only $4,500. You don't have to pay a lot to find out. And he's going up against one of the worst defenses in all the Power 5 conferences. From there, their receiver core is pretty bleak from a fantasy perspective. J. Michael Sturdivant, the Cal transfer, is still out there on the field. Like he's running routes, he's getting targets, but he's not producing a whole lot. Only $3,900. He might be worth a look. And then from there, it's just a whole lot of question marks. Keegan Jones at only $3,000 is probably the next guy I would play. He gets design touches, meaning he's getting the ball on like screens and jet sweeps and stuff like that, where they're just getting the ball in his hands. And if he ends up doing that and scoring a touchdown, he'd give you a very solid week. But it's a shame that with this UCLA receiver room and really the USC receiver room, that we've got a game environment that's so juicy, 65-point total, and just so few guys that are like solid, consistent options in fantasy. It's really disappointing that the best game environment of the week has a lot of guys that just you don't really ever know if they're going to go off or not, and it makes it really hard to target for that reason. Now, Oklahoma is a team that I do want to talk about. So we've been kind of monitoring this Oklahoma situation from ever since Andrell Anthony got hurt against Texas, how these guys have been performing. And we've talked about that three of Stoops, Anderson, Farouk being out on the field the whole time. And how would, the production of Anthony be distributed to everybody? Well, it turns out that all of Andrell Anthony's production is going to Drake Stoops. He's had 33 and 47 fantasy points in his last two games. He's led the team in targets in the last two games. He's led the team in receiving in the last two games. In fact, he's averaging about 10 targets per game in the 4 games since Andrell Anthony got injured. So Drake Stoops appears to be the beneficiary of that injury, appears to have really upped his game since that injury. And if you're playing an Oklahoma receiver, he is the one that I would want. Now, I don't mind Farouk either because as a Texas fan watching that game, he was the one I feared. Like when Texas played Oklahoma, I didn't want the ball going to Jalil Farouk because he is a chance to make one guy miss and take it 80 yards to the house at any time. So I would probably prefer playing him over Nick Anderson for that reason. Now, last few notes at the wide receiver position. Houston and Oklahoma State, we've talked about how juicy this game environment is. Well, for Houston, their former number one wide receiver, Marcus Golden, is now out for the season. And so what you're going to see is you're going to see increased targets for Samuel Brown and Joseph Manjack. And the guy who's probably going to be on the field more is Dalton Carnes. He has been the next guy in terms of snap share in the last few weeks for this Houston offense. He is the guy that I would prefer playing to try to make that golden production. You've got Johnson and Cobbs that are priced above him. Both those guys are probably going to play as well, but everything I've seen has indicated that it will likely be Dalton Carnes who is ending up playing more snaps due to that golden injury. Now, the Oklahoma State side of things is also interesting to target because, this is going to be a really high-scoring game, right? Jaden Bray is still questionable. We have no update as to what his status is. But what's happening, though, is that the 3 receivers that Oklahoma State's been playing have all been able to produce. Leon Johnson at only $4,800, and then Brandon Presley at $5,500, and Rashad Owens at $5,600. All 3 of those guys have been producing quite steadily since Jaden Bray got injured, and I do think that they are playable in a game stack or not a game stack for that matter. The one who is leading them in targets is Rashad Owens. He would probably be my preferred play. He's only scored 1 touchdown all year, so the second this guy starts scoring touchdowns, he's instantly going to pay off that price tag of $5,600. Now, last 3 teams, to talk about. First of which is the James Madison App State game. For James Madison, we talked about him a few weeks back when they were incredible misprices. Reggie Brown and Elijah Surratt are their two guys in this receiving room, and DraftKings has priced them up a little bit. I don't think they're a gross misprice now, but I still think they're very affordable to get to. And both of these guys have had big time games for James Madison this season. Both of them have had games of over 30 fantasy points. Both of them have had multiple games of over 30 fantasy points. So I think they're both in play. And I think you can even play both of them. You can go McLeod, Brown, Surratt, and just hope that the passing game has a ceiling game for this JMU offense. If you're looking to pivot from those two guys, you've got Zach Horton, the tight end. You've got Phoenix Sproles, the slot. If you were to want to get a piece of the JMU passing game and have it not be Brown or Surratt, or get a little bit of leverage on Brown and Surratt, Horton and Sproles are the two guys that you would want to target. Both those guys have been pretty consistent producers. They just haven't really had a ceiling week as a part of this passing game. And it's been because Brown and Surratt are the two that have the ceiling weeks. On the App State side of things, Caden Robinson appears to be the best points per dollar play. I don't know why he is priced at only $4,900, but he's been a pretty consistent contributor to this offense week in, week out. Has 2 games over 25 fantasy points. So if this game turns into a shootout, he is probably going to be the guy that you're going to want to have because of the fact that JMU doesn't let people run the ball against them. And last team to talk about is Notre Dame. So Notre Dame has been dealing with that injury to tight end Mitchell Evans, who was their number one target. And Holden Stace has been playing that role. He didn't have a very productive game against Clemson, but he was out on the field quite a bit. And I think that he would be in line for a pretty big game if Sam Hartman continues to target the tight ends. You've also got Chris Tyree, who led the team in targets against Clemson. And he's a guy who's a converted running back who is very explosive, very speedy with the ball in his hands. He could end up giving you a pretty solid performance as well. And then if you're looking for upside for this Notre Dame receiving corps, Rico Flores is a really talented freshman who's been a part of the game plan pretty consistently. And, if this Notre Dame passing attack has a big time week, it might be Rico Flores breaking off a long play or two. So I don't mind targeting this Notre Dame passing game as some cheap salary relief against this Wake Forest defense. All right, that does it for the Week 12 College Football DFS preview. Hopefully gave you guys all the information you need to build some winning lineups this week. Remember, if you want more from me, you can follow me on X at Mike's Money Picks. Link is in the description for the Fantasy Corner Discord and for the Patreon. So head on over to those if you are interested in either of those. But other than that, that's pretty much all we got for Week 12, y'all. We will be back next week talking NFL, college football, and college basketball because it's a big week in college basketball next week. We've also got 2 big-time slates lined up for college football next week on Friday and Saturday. So I'm hoping to be able to talk about both of those to you guys, but it should be really fun next week, or really fun week next week with Thanksgiving. So I'm really looking forward to it. But we've reached the end of this episode, guys. So thank you guys for listening, and I will see you next time. Best of luck to you this week.